Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to another Life History channel. I hope you are ready to sleep. Close your eyes and picture the massive crowd spread across our world right now. From beneath Tokyo's neon lights to Norway's frozen shores, from New York's skyscrapers to Peru's misty mountains, right now, exactly 8 billion people are breathing. We're dreaming in 7,000 different languages, living in vastly different cultures. Yet beneath all this chaos and diversity lies a startling truth. All of our roots extend to the same soil, to a single continent. Africa, not Europe, not Asia, not some legendary city beneath the ocean, just Africa. This is a miracle worth contemplating. It's as if an invisible hand decided to start all of human history from a single point. We didn't sprout simultaneously in different places. We are the branches of a single seed spread across the world. The scientific community has pursued this question for a century. Why there? Why not somewhere else? Despite having genome maps, fossils, and satellite data, the answer to this question remained shrouded in mystery. Until recently. Tonight I'll tell you the story of that missing piece. If you're using this voice as a harbor to drift off to sleep, you're in the right place. You can even share in the comments which corner of the world you're tuning in from, what time of day or night it is. The fact that dawn might be breaking in Melbourne while it's midnight in Manchester, yet we're all meeting in this same voice. That's truly enchanting. Now lean back, because we're embarking on humanity's strange, paradox-filled and miraculous journey. Then, starting in 2023, everything changed. A series of groundbreaking discoveries from genetics, paleoclimatology, archaeology, and neuroscience began converging on the same answer, and suddenly the picture crystallized. Scientists weren't just finding new evidence, they were finding the final piece, the piece that made all other pieces fall into place and revealed why human evolution could only have happened in Africa. This evening we'll examine this evidence together. We'll discover what made Africa not just a good place for human evolution, but the only possible place. We'll look at recent genetic discoveries that reveal shocking truths about our ancestors' survival. We'll study Africa's unique climate patterns that created an evolutionary pressure cooker on the continent, unlike anywhere else on Earth. We'll dive into the geography that transformed the continent into a natural laboratory perfectly designed to create intelligent, adaptable, endlessly curious creatures like us. And finally, you'll understand something that has eluded scientists for over a century. You'll see why every person alive today carries Africa in their DNA, in their bones, in the structure of their brains. You'll comprehend why our origin story couldn't have happened anywhere else. This isn't just about where we came from. It's about understanding why we are the way we are, why we think the way we do, why we survived when countless other human species perished. The answer was hiding in plain sight, written in our genes, carved into Africa's landscape, preserved in ancient sediment layers, and now at last we can read it. So let's go back to Africa, to a continent that was about to shape humanity in ways we're only now beginning to understand. Before we can understand why humans evolved only in Africa, we need to establish something absolutely fundamental, something that took scientists over a century to prove beyond reasonable doubt. We must recognize that Africa wasn't just one of several places where humans evolved. It was the place, the only place. Every single step of human evolution happened in Africa, from the first ape-like creatures that began walking upright to the modern humans who would eventually colonize the world. And here's the thing, this wasn't always obvious. In fact, for decades, many scientists thought human evolution happened in Asia. When the first Neanderthal fossils were discovered in Europe in the 1800s, people assumed that's where humanity began. When Peking man was found in China in the 1920s, it seemed to confirm Asia as humanity's cradle. Africa was barely considered. The racism of the era made it almost unthinkable that humanity's birthplace could be on a continent that European colonizers dismissed as primitive. But then the fossils started telling a different story, a story so clear, so undeniable, that it would completely overturn everything scientists thought they knew about human origins. The breakthrough came in 1924, when Raymond Dart, an anatomy professor in South Africa, received a box of fossils from a limestone quarry. Inside was a skull, small, childlike, but with features that didn't match any known ape. This was the first discovery of Australopithecus africanus, an ancient human ancestor that walked upright but still had an ape-sized brain. It was 2.8 million years old, and it had died in Africa. Dart's discovery was met with skepticism, even mockery. How could Africa be important for human evolution? But he was right. And over the next 100 years, every major discovery in human evolution would prove him right again and again. Because here's what happened next. When scientists started looking seriously at Africa, they couldn't stop finding fossils, not just one or two lucky finds, but thousands of specimens spanning millions of years, and they all told the same story: the oldest, most primitive human ancestors. In Africa, the slightly more advanced ones. Africa, the transitional forms between apes and humans. Africa, the first tool users. Africa, the first members of our own genus, Homo. You guessed it, Africa. By the 1960s and 70s, the evidence was becoming irrefutable. Lewis and Mary Leakey's excavations at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania were uncovering layers of human evolution like pages in a history book. They found Homo habilis, the first species of our genus, dating to about 2.4 million years ago. They found stone tools alongside animal bones, evidence of butchery and food processing. They found living floors where ancient humans camped, made tools, and ate. All in Africa, all older than anything found anywhere else. Then came Lucy. In 1974, Donald Johanson and his team discovered an almost complete skeleton in Ethiopia, Australopithecus afarensis, 3.2 million years old. She was small, just over 3 feet tall, but she walked upright on 2 legs. Her hip bones proved it. Her leg bones proved it. Her foot bones proved it. Lucy was a human ancestor, no doubt about it, and she had lived and died in Africa's Great Rift Valley. The Great Rift Valley. This geological feature stretching thousands of kilometers from Ethiopia to Mozambique became known as the cradle of humankind. And for good reason. Nearly every major fossil discovery in human evolution came from sites along or near the Rift Valley. It was as if the Earth had opened specifically to preserve our evolutionary history. Why the Rift Valley? Because rifts create exactly the right conditions for fossilization. The geological activity brings minerals to the surface that help preserve bones. Volcanic eruptions that occur in rift regions bury areas with ash, creating time capsules that can be precisely dated using radiometric techniques. The sedimentary layers that accumulate in Rift Valley lakes preserve everything that falls into them: footprints, tools, pollen, animal remains, everything you need to reconstruct ancient environments and the creatures that lived in them. And those fossils just kept getting older. In the 1990s and 2000s, teams working in Ethiopia, Kenya and Chad began finding specimens that pushed the human family tree back to 6 then 7 million years ago. Ardipithecus ramidus at 4.4 million years, Orantuganensis at 6 million years, Sahelanthropus chadensis at 7 million years. Each discovery was more primitive, more ape-like, yet each showed those crucial markers of human ancestry: changes in the pelvis, changes in the legs, changes in the skull, changes showing these creatures were on their way to becoming us. And each one individually was found in Africa. By the early 2000s, the fossil evidence was so overwhelming that no serious scientist questioned Africa's primacy anymore. The fossil record clearly showed that human evolution happened in Africa millions of years before our ancestors finally left the continent. But fossils can only tell you so much. They can show you what ancient creatures looked like and roughly when they lived, but they can't prove direct ancestry. They can't show you the unbroken line from ancient apes to modern humans. For that, you need DNA. The genetic revolution of the 1980s and 90s completely transformed our understanding of human origins, and once again every discovery pointed to Africa. The major breakthrough came in 1987 when Rebecca Cann and colleagues published a study analyzing mitochondrial DNA from people around the world. Mitochondrial DNA is special because it's passed down only through the maternal line. It doesn't recombine like nuclear DNA. It just accumulates random mutations at a fairly steady rate, creating a kind of molecular clock. When Cann's team analyzed mitochondrial DNA from various populations, they found something remarkable. All modern humans could be traced back to a common female ancestor who lived in Africa between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. The media dubbed her Mitochondrial Eve, and suddenly the genetic evidence was confirming what the fossils had been saying all along. Modern humans originated in Africa. But there's more. In the 1990s, scientists did a similar analysis using Y chromosome DNA, which is passed down only through the paternal line. Again, they found Y chromosome Adam, a common male ancestor of all living humans who lived in Africa, probably between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. Now, Eve and Adam didn't know each other. They lived thousands of years apart, but they both lived in Africa, and every person alive today carries genetic material descended from both of them. The genetic evidence kept piling up. As DNA sequencing became cheaper and more sophisticated, researchers began analyzing nuclear DNA from populations worldwide, and they discovered something that should be surprising but actually makes perfect sense. African populations have more genetic diversity than all other human populations on Earth combined. Think about what this means. You could take DNA samples from people in Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas, and you'd find less genetic variation than you'd find in a single Ethiopian village. Billions of people spread across 6 continents have less variation than a few thousand people in a single African community. This is the diversity paradox, and it's one of the strongest pieces of evidence for African origins. Because genetic diversity accumulates over time, the longer a population has existed somewhere, the more mutations accumulate, the more variation develops. African populations have the most diversity because they've been there the longest. They are the source population. Everyone else descends from a small subset of Africans who left the continent relatively recently. The numbers are striking. Nuclear DNA studies show that non-African populations contain only about 5 to 10% of the genetic variation found in Africa. This isn't a bit less diversity. This is dramatically less, and it tells us that all non-African populations descended from a small founder group that left Africa probably no more than 100,000 years ago, carrying with them only a fraction of Africa's total genetic diversity. This pattern emerges everywhere you look. In immune system genes, in genes affecting skin color, hair texture, and facial features, in genes affecting metabolism, disease resistance, and even personality traits. The most variation is always in Africa. The farther you get from Africa, the less variation you find. It's like following a river back to its source. The genetic evidence creates a clear trail leading back to a single continent, Africa. But the genetic evidence isn't just about diversity, it's also about time. By analyzing mutation rates and comparing genetic differences between populations, scientists can estimate when different groups diverged, and the timeline they reconstruct matches almost perfectly with the fossil record. The oldest splits in the human family tree separate different African populations from each other. The San and Co peoples of southern Africa diverged from other African groups perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. West African populations split from East African populations at various points over the last 100,000 years. But after all these intra-African splits, we see the split between Africans and non-Africans around 60,000 to 100,000 years ago. The genetic evidence is so clear that you can see our species' entire history written in the patterns of DNA variation, and it all starts in Africa. Everything points to Africa. There's no other interpretation that makes sense. Now, let's talk about the archaeological sites that preserve this incredible story, because the physical places where these discoveries were made aren't just random locations. They're windows into specific moments in human evolution. Each one adds vital details to our understanding of how we became human. Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania is probably the most famous. The Leakeys worked there for decades, uncovering layer upon layer of human occupation dating back nearly 2 million years. The gorge cut through the sediments like slicing a cake, exposing ancient living floors where Homo habilis made stone tools, where Homo erectus butchered animals, places where early humans lived, worked and died, generations of them. The stone tools found there show technological evolution over time. Simple choppers giving way to more sophisticated hand axes, each layer representing thousands of years of improvement and innovation. Omo Kibish in Ethiopia gave us something even more significant. In 1967, Richard Leakey's team found 2 partial skulls, Omo I and Omo II, in sediments along the Omo River. For decades they were thought to be about 130,000 years old. But in 2005, new dating techniques pushed that age back to 95,000 years. These were Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, and they were much older than anyone expected. Omo showed that our species had existed for at least 200,000 years, all of it in Africa. Then came Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. In 2017, excavations at this site revealed the oldest Homo sapiens fossils ever discovered, 315,000 years old. The skulls showed a mixture of modern and archaic features. The face looked modern, but the skull was still somewhat elongated. These were humans in transition, early Homo sapiens who hadn't yet developed all the features we see in people alive today. But they were making complex stone tools. They were controlling fire. They were doing things only humans do. And they were in Africa, not in Europe or Asia where some researchers had hoped to find early humans, pushing our species' origin even further back in time, and once again confirming that every stage of human evolution happened on this single continent. The timeline these pieces of evidence create is striking in its clarity. 7 million years ago, the first hominins split from the ancestors of modern chimpanzees in Africa. 4 million years ago, Australopithecines were walking upright in East Africa's forests and grasslands. 2.8 million years ago, the first stone tools appeared in Africa's archaeological record. 2.4 million years ago, the genus Homo emerged in Africa. 1.9 million years ago, Homo erectus developed and began spreading. And yes, erectus eventually left Africa and colonized parts of Asia. But erectus evolved in Africa first. It's an African species expanding its range. By 800,000 years ago, the genetic bottleneck we mentioned earlier had fundamentally shaped human evolution. All surviving populations were African. They never left the continent during this critical period. By 300,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens were emerging in Africa, still evolving, still developing the features that would make them fully modern. By 200,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans were present across much of Africa, and for the next 140,000 years, they stayed there, they evolved there, they thrived there, they developed the cognitive and cultural abilities that would eventually allow them to dominate the planet. But they didn't leave. 6 to 7 million years of human evolution, dozens of species in our family tree, hundreds of evolutionary transitions from ape-like ancestors to modern humans, and every single step happened in Africa. Not in Europe, Not in Asia, not in multiple places simultaneously with different lineages converging on similar solutions, just Africa. This isn't just remarkable, it's unprecedented. No other mammalian genus shows this kind of geographic restriction for such a long time. Bears evolved across the northern hemisphere. Cats evolved and spread across multiple continents. Even our closest relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, evolved in Africa, but have different ancestral ranges. But humans and all our extinct relatives stayed in Africa for millions of years, evolving, diversifying, going extinct and replacing each other, all within the boundaries of a single continent. Why? Why did human evolution happen only in Africa? Why not in Asia with its vast lands and diverse environments? Why not Europe? Why not the Americas or Australia? That's the question we're going to answer, because now that we've established beyond any doubt that Africa is where human evolution happened, we need to understand what made Africa special. What was it about this one continent that created the perfect conditions for apes to become human? The answer lies in a unique combination of factors found nowhere else on Earth. Climate, geography, ecology, predators, all coming together to create what scientists now call the perfect evolutionary pressure cooker. A place where natural selection could work its magic over millions of years, shaping our ancestors in ways that would have been impossible anywhere else. And it all begins with something that seems simple but turns out to be incredibly important: Africa's climate. Not just what the climate was like, but how it changed, how unpredictable it was, how it created exactly the right kind of environmental pressure to force rapid evolution. Let's look at that now. Let's talk about climate now. Not the boring kind from geography class, but the kind that literally builds species from scratch. Because Africa wasn't just where humans evolved. Africa's climate created the special conditions that forced our ancestors to become what we are today. Between 3 million and 1 million years ago, East Africa experienced something unprecedented in Earth's history. The climate didn't just change, it fluctuated wildly, unpredictably, ruthlessly. Every few thousand years, sometimes every few hundred years, the entire region swung between vastly different environmental conditions. Imagine this. Your ancestors are living in a lush forest environment. Trees everywhere, reliable fruit sources, predictable water. Life is relatively easy. You don't need to be particularly smart to survive. You just need to know which trees have food and which predators to avoid. Simple, comfortable, evolutionarily stagnant. Then over just a few generations, maybe 50 to 100 years, the forest starts dying. Trees that have been there for 1,000 years begin thinning out. Fruit becomes scarce. Water sources that have been reliable forever start drying up. The forest transforms into savanna, open grassland with scattered trees. Everything your ancestors knew about survival suddenly becomes invalid. But here's the thing. This wasn't a one-time event. It happened again and again. Forest to savanna, savanna to forest. Wet periods to dry periods, predictable to chaotic. For 2 million years, East Africa's climate was like a cosmic light switch being flipped back and forth by a bored god. The geological evidence for this is stunning. Lake cores from East Africa show dramatic changes in vegetation types. Pollen records reveal forests appearing and disappearing over just a few 1,000-year timescales. Sediment layers tell stories of massive lakes that formed and then completely evaporated, sometimes multiple times within a single human lifetime. This created what biologists call environmental heterogeneity. Not just diversity, but unpredictable, unstable diversity. The kind that doesn't allow species to get comfortable with any particular survival strategy. Think about what this means from an evolutionary perspective. In a stable environment, natural selection favors specialists, animals perfectly adapted to a specific lifestyle. Pandas eating bamboo, koalas eating eucalyptus, polar bears hunting seals on ice. These species are incredibly good at what they do. but only in their specific environments. Change that environment, and they're doomed. But in an unstable environment, specialists become a liability. That panda-level specialization that works great in stable conditions becomes a death sentence when the environment keeps changing. Natural selection starts favoring something completely different. Generalists, adaptable species that can shift strategies when conditions change. And not just any kind of adaptability, but cognitive adaptability. The ability to find new solutions to new problems, to learn, to innovate, to plan ahead. This is where the famous savanna hypothesis comes into play. For decades, anthropologists believed that the retreat of African forests forced our ancestors into open grasslands, and this single environmental shift drove human evolution. Standing upright to see over tall grass, developing tools to hunt on the plains, becoming smarter to survive in a more dangerous environment. But the savanna hypothesis was too simple. It wasn't a single transition from forest to grassland that made us human. It was the constant oscillation between environments. The climate kept pulling the rug out from under our ancestors' feet, forcing them to adapt again and again. The temperature ranges during this period were perfect for this kind of evolutionary pressure. And by perfect, I mean Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold, but challenging enough to push our ancestors without killing them outright. During this period, East African temperatures varied between roughly 15 to 30 Celsius, 59 to 86 Celsius for those following along. Warm enough that you wouldn't need elaborate shelter or clothing to survive, but with enough variation to create seasonal challenges, cool nights requiring fire management, hot days requiring understanding of water conservation. Compare this to other regions during the same period. Northern latitudes were experiencing ice ages, glaciers advancing and retreating, temperatures dropping so low that survival required very specific adaptations. Thick fur, massive body size, extreme cold tolerance, these conditions produce specialists like mammoths and woolly rhinoceros. Impressive, but not cognitively flexible. Meanwhile, tropical rainforests were highly stable, temperatures barely fluctuated, food sources remained relatively constant year-round. Species in these environments became incredibly specialized in their own niches. Amazing adaptations, but no pressure to develop general intelligence. East Africa was the sweet spot. Variable enough to prevent specialization, stable enough to prevent extinction. The climate was like a personal trainer who knew exactly how hard to push you. Enough challenge to force adaptation, enough recovery time to consolidate gains. Rainfall patterns were particularly important. East Africa doesn't get regular rain throughout the year. It has distinct wet and dry seasons, and the timing and intensity of these seasons varied dramatically over thousands of years. During wet periods, the region received abundant rainfall, rivers overflowed, lakes expanded, grasslands flourished, animal populations exploded. For our ancestors, these were times of relative abundance, but they couldn't relax and enjoy it, because somewhere in their cultural memory, they knew dry times always returned. Dry periods could last years, even decades. Rainfall would drop dramatically. Water sources would become scattered and unreliable. Massive herds would migrate or die. Surviving these periods required planning, cooperation, and detailed environmental knowledge. You needed to know where permanent water sources were. You needed to understand animal migration patterns to predict where food would be. You needed technologies to store and process foods when they were available. Most importantly, you needed social systems complex enough to maintain cooperation during times of scarcity. This is where cognitive development really accelerated. Your ancestors weren't just reacting to immediate conditions. They were thinking ahead, planning for dry seasons during wet seasons, remembering where resources had been in previous cycles, sharing knowledge about long-term environmental patterns across generations. Archaeological evidence supports this. Stone tool caches appear in the record around 2 million years ago. These aren't random tools scattered across the landscape. They're deliberately placed stockpiles, resources stored for future use. Our ancestors were literally planning ahead, anticipating future needs and preparing for them. Let's talk about climate now. Not the boring kind from geography class, but the kind that literally builds species from scratch. Because Africa wasn't just where humans evolved. Africa's climate created the special conditions that forced our ancestors to become what we are today. Between 3 million and 1 million years ago, East Africa experienced something unprecedented in Earth's history. The climate didn't just change, it fluctuated wildly, unpredictably, ruthlessly. Every few thousand years, sometimes every few hundred years, the entire region swung between vastly different environmental conditions. Imagine this. Your ancestors are living in a lush forest environment. Trees everywhere, reliable fruit sources, predictable water. Life is relatively easy. You don't need to be particularly smart to survive. You just need to know which trees have food and which predators to avoid. Simple, comfortable, evolutionarily stagnant. Then over just a few generations, maybe 50 to 100 years, the forest starts dying. Trees that have been there for 1,000 years begin thinning out. Fruit becomes scarce. Water sources that have been reliable forever start drying up. The forest transforms into savanna, open grassland with scattered trees. Everything your ancestors knew about survival suddenly becomes invalid. But here's the thing. This wasn't a one-time event. It happened again and again. Forest to savanna, savanna to forest. Wet periods to dry periods, predictable to chaotic. For 2 million years, East Africa's climate was like a cosmic light switch being flipped back and forth by a bored god. The geological evidence for this is stunning. Lake cores from East Africa show dramatic changes in vegetation types. Pollen records reveal forests appearing and disappearing over just a few thousand-year timescales. Sediment layers tell stories of massive lakes that formed and then completely evaporated, sometimes multiple times within a single human lifetime. This created what biologists call environmental heterogeneity. Not just diversity, but unpredictable, unstable diversity. The kind that doesn't allow species to get comfortable with any particular survival strategy. Think about what this means from an evolutionary perspective. In a stable environment, natural selection favors specialists, animals perfectly adapted to a specific lifestyle. Pandas eating bamboo, koalas eating eucalyptus, polar bears hunting seals on ice. These species are incredibly good at what they do, but only in their specific environments. Change that environment and they're doomed. But in an unstable environment, specialists become a liability. That panda-level specialization that works great in stable conditions becomes a death sentence when the environment keeps changing. Natural selection starts favoring something completely different. Generalists, adaptable species that can shift strategies when conditions change. And not just any kind of adaptability, but cognitive adaptability, the ability to find new solutions to new problems, to learn, to innovate, to plan ahead. This is where the famous savanna hypothesis comes into play. For decades, anthropologists believed that the retreat of African forests forced our ancestors into open grasslands, and this single environmental shift drove human evolution. Standing upright to see over tall grass, developing tools to hunt on the plains, becoming smarter to survive in a more dangerous environment. But the savanna hypothesis was too simple. It wasn't a single transition from forest to grassland that made us human. It was the constant oscillation between environments. The climate kept pulling the rug out from under our ancestors' feet, forcing them to adapt again and again. The temperature ranges during this period were perfect for this kind of evolutionary pressure. And by perfect, I mean Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold, but challenging enough to push our ancestors without killing them outright. During this period, East African temperatures varied between roughly 15 to 30 Celsius, 59 to 86 Fahrenheit for those following along, warm enough that you wouldn't need elaborate shelter or clothing to survive, but with enough variation to create seasonal challenges, cool nights requiring fire management, hot days requiring understanding of water conservation. Compare this to other regions during the same period. Northern latitudes were experiencing ice ages, glaciers advancing and retreating, temperatures dropping so low that survival required very specific adaptations. Thick fur, massive body size, extreme cold tolerance, these conditions produce specialists like mammoths and woolly rhinoceros. Impressive, but not cognitively flexible. Meanwhile, tropical rainforests were highly stable, temperatures barely fluctuated, food sources remained relatively constant year-round. Species in these environments became incredibly specialized in their own niches. Amazing adaptations, but no pressure to develop general intelligence. East Africa was the sweet spot. Variable enough to prevent specialization, stable enough to prevent extinction. The climate was like a personal trainer who knew exactly how hard to push you. Enough challenge to force adaptation, enough recovery time to consolidate gains. Rainfall patterns were particularly important. East Africa doesn't get regular rain throughout the year. It has distinct wet and dry seasons, and the timing and intensity of these seasons varied dramatically over thousands of years. During wet periods, the region received abundant rainfall. Rivers overflowed, lakes expanded, grasslands flourished, animal populations exploded. For our ancestors, these were times of relative abundance, but they couldn't relax and enjoy it, because somewhere in their cultural memory, they knew dry times always returned. Dry periods could last years, even decades. Rainfall would drop dramatically. Water sources would become scattered and unreliable. Massive herds would migrate or die. Surviving these periods required planning, cooperation, and detailed environmental knowledge. You needed to know where permanent water sources were. You needed to understand animal migration patterns to predict where food would be. You needed technologies to store and process foods when they were available. Most importantly, you needed social systems complex enough to maintain cooperation during times of scarcity. This is where cognitive development really accelerated. Your ancestors weren't just reacting to immediate conditions. They were thinking ahead, planning for dry seasons during wet seasons, remembering where resources had been in previous cycles, sharing knowledge about long-term environmental patterns across generations. Archaeological evidence supports this. Stone tool caches appear in the record around 2 million years ago. These aren't random tools scattered across the landscape. They're deliberately placed stockpiles, resources stored for future use. Our ancestors were literally planning ahead, anticipating future needs and preparing for them. Now this is where the story gets really interesting, because it wasn't just Africa's climate that made us human. It was the continent's unique geography, Africa's position on the globe, the arrangement of its mountains, valleys, and deserts, all creating what biologists call a natural laboratory, a place where evolution could run experiments that would be impossible anywhere else. Let's start with the most obvious feature, Africa's isolation. For millions of years, during the critical period of human evolution, Africa was effectively an island, not surrounded by water, but by equally effective barriers. To the north, the Mediterranean and later the expanding Sahara Desert. To the east and west, oceans. To the south, thousands of miles of land ending in frigid waters that early humans had no technology to cross. This meant that the evolutionary experiments happening in Africa stayed in Africa. There was no easy escape route, no migration valve that would allow populations to disperse before natural selection finished its work. Your ancestors were trapped, locked into a continent-scale laboratory where the only way out was to develop the abilities needed to overcome these barriers. Think about what this means. In Eurasia, early human populations could always move when conditions got tough. Climate too cold in the north, head south. Resources depleted in one region, migrate to another. This constant movement actually slowed evolution. Why adapt to challenging conditions when you can just leave? But Africa's barriers made leaving impossible. When the climate turned brutal, when resources became scarce, when predators became more dangerous, African populations had two options: adapt or die. There was no third option, no migration escape valve to release evolutionary pressure, and that pressure built over millions of years. Generations upon generations of humans facing challenges they couldn't escape, forced to develop solutions rather than just moving to places that didn't require solutions. This is what evolutionary biologists call a selection trap. But it's a productive trap, the kind that forces innovation rather than extinction. But Africa's isolation wasn't uniform. And this is crucial because within this isolated continent, geography created something even more remarkable: a patchwork of separated but proximate environments, each acting as its own mini-laboratory, yet close enough to exchange genes and ideas when conditions allowed. The key to understanding this is the Sahara Desert. Today we think of the Sahara as a permanent feature, 3.6 million square miles of sand and rock, the world's largest hot desert. But it hasn't always been there. The Sahara appeared and disappeared dozens of times over the last few million years. Every time Earth's climate shifted, every time rainfall patterns changed, the desert transformed. During wet periods, the Sahara became a green corridor, grasslands, lakes, rivers filled with wildlife. Populations could move freely between North Africa and sub-Saharan regions. Genes could flow, technologies could spread. Different human groups could meet, interbreed, share knowledge. This is what anthropologists call a dispersal corridor. But here's the brilliant part. These green periods never lasted long. Maybe 5,000 years, maybe 10,000 years. Then the climate would shift again, and the Sahara would return. Grasslands would die, lakes would evaporate, rivers would disappear, and populations caught on the wrong side would be isolated again. This created a natural pump for human evolution. Connection periods when genetic and cultural mixing was possible, followed by isolation periods that allowed local adaptations to develop. Then connection again, mixing those new adaptations back into the broader population. Then isolation again, encouraging more innovation, over and over for millions of years. No other continent had this feature. Eurasia was too well connected. Populations could always stay in contact, meaning there was never sustained isolation for local adaptations to develop. Australia was too isolated and too small, with too little environmental variation to drive complex adaptations. South America was isolated, but didn't have the right combination of climate pressure and ecological diversity. Only Africa had the Sahara pump. Only Africa had this mechanism to create, mix and refine human adaptations over millions of years. But the Sahara wasn't the only geographic feature shaping human evolution. Within sub-Saharan Africa itself, topography created an even more complex system of barriers and corridors. The Great Rift Valley, that massive geological scar running from Ethiopia to Mozambique, divided East Africa into a series of distinct ecological zones. On one side of the rift, you'd have mountain forests, cool, wet, full of fruit trees and forest animals. Just 50 miles away on the other side, you'd have hot, dry grasslands, completely different vegetation, completely different prey species, completely different survival challenges, and separating them, steep valley walls, fast-flowing rivers, volcanic peaks, barriers that were easy to see but hard to cross. This created what biologists call parapatric speciation zones, populations living close enough to occasionally exchange genes, but separated enough to face different selection pressures. One group adapting to forest life, developing strategies for gathering food in trees and dealing with forest predators. Another group adapting to grassland life, learning to track prey in open terrain and avoid savanna predators. But every few generations, some individuals would cross the barriers. They'd interbreed with the other group, mixing forest-adapted genes with grassland-adapted genes. And here's where something remarkable happened. The offspring of these mixed populations often had hybrid vigor. They inherited survival strategies from both environments. This made them more adaptable, more flexible, better able to handle environmental changes. And remember what we said about Africa's climate. It was constantly fluctuating. Forests would turn into grasslands, grasslands into deserts, then back again. In this unstable environment, being able to handle multiple habitat types wasn't just advantageous, it was essential for survival. The Rift Valley system provided something else equally important: water, permanent water. Even during the worst droughts, the deep lakes of the Rift Valley system never completely dried up. Lake Turkana, Lake Victoria, Lake Malawi, Lake Tanganyika. These weren't seasonal pools that came and went with the rains. These were massive bodies of water fed by underground aquifers and high mountain streams. They persisted through every climate cycle. Why does this matter? Because permanent water sources created refugia, places where life could survive even when the surrounding landscape turned to dust. During drought periods, populations would contract toward these water sources. Different groups, different species, all squeezed into narrow bands around the lakes and rivers. This created intense competition for resources and triggered rapid evolution of intelligence and tool use. You had to be smart to compete with other groups for limited resources near water, but it also created opportunities for knowledge exchange. When times were tough and everyone was congregating around the same water sources, technologies could spread rapidly. Someone discovered a new way to process plant foods. That innovation could spread to a dozen different groups in a single generation because they were all living within a few days' walk of each other. This accelerated cultural evolution far beyond what would have been possible if populations were completely isolated. Now, this is where the story gets truly fascinating, because all these environmental pressures, all this geographic isolation, all these predator and prey dynamics, they weren't just selecting for stronger bodies or better immune systems. They were creating something unprecedented in Earth's history of life. They were building the human mind. Let me paint you a picture. 4 million years ago, your ancestor stands at the edge of a grassland in East Africa. And I mean stands, not crouching like a chimpanzee, not knuckle-walking like a gorilla, but fully upright on 2 legs. This is bipedalism, and it's absolutely revolutionary. But what most people don't realize is this: bipedalism wasn't some random mutation that happened to work. It was a direct response to Africa's unique conditions. Think about it. The forests were fragmenting. The climate was getting drier. Your ancestors were spending more and more time moving between scattered tree patches in open grasslands. And in those grasslands, standing upright gave you advantages that were literally life or death. You could see over tall grass to spot predators. You could carry food and babies while traveling. You could cover longer distances more efficiently because walking on 2 legs uses less energy than knuckle walking. Most importantly, you freed your hands. And when your hands were no longer needed for locomotion, evolution could start developing them for other purposes: more precise manipulation, better grasping, the ability to make tools. 3.3 million years ago, somewhere in East Africa, one of your ancestors picked up a rock and deliberately struck it against another rock to create a sharp edge. We know this because we found the tools. Simple stone flakes, nothing fancy, but unquestionably manufactured. Someone specifically selected those rocks. Someone understood that striking them together in a certain way would produce a sharp edge. Someone had developed a mental model of cause and effect complex enough to plan and execute a multi-step process. This might not seem revolutionary, but think about what it requires. You have to be able to imagine something that doesn't exist yet. You have to understand material properties, how different rocks break in different ways. You need fine motor control to strike at exactly the right angle with exactly the right force, and you have to remember the technique well enough to teach it to others. That first toolmaker was exhibiting abstract thought, planning, and cultural transmission, all signs of a cognitive revolution just beginning, and the revolution rapidly accelerated. By 2.5 million years ago, your ancestors weren't just making occasional flakes, they were producing standardized tools, hand axes with symmetrical shapes, carefully worked scrapers, sophisticated choppers. Archaeological sites from this period show what anthropologists call the Oldowan tool tradition, a specific set of techniques spread across East Africa. This is cultural evolution at work, not just individuals learning to make tools, but entire populations sharing techniques, refining methods, transmitting knowledge across generations. And this is happening in Africa, because Africa's conditions demanded it. See, in the increasingly seasonal African environment, you couldn't always rely on soft fruits and vegetation. Sometimes you needed to process tougher foods, cut meat from carcasses before scavengers drove you away, break open bones to access the nutritious marrow inside, dig up underground tubers when surface vegetation disappeared during dry seasons. Without tools, you'd starve. With tools, you survived. Natural selection was ruthless and efficient. Individuals better at making and using tools could access more calories. More calories meant healthier offspring. Healthier offspring meant your genes spread through the population. But here's where things get really crazy. Those tools weren't just helping your ancestors get food, they were changing their brains. Because in the human fossil record, there's a direct relationship between tool complexity and brain size. Around 2 million years ago, as tool technology became more complex, human brain size started increasing dramatically. Homo habilis, one of your earliest tool-making ancestors, had a brain of about 600 cubic centimeters. Within 1 million years, Homo erectus had an average brain of 900 cubic centimeters. Modern humans clock in at about 1,350 cubic centimeters. That's more than double the brain size in just 2 million years, which is lightning fast evolutionarily. And this is happening specifically in Africa, driven by Africa's unique challenges. Because brains are expensive, I mean really expensive. Your brain makes up about 2% of your body weight, but uses 20% of your calories. Growing and maintaining a large brain requires massive energy investment. This is what anthropologists call the expensive tissue hypothesis. You can't evolve a bigger brain without a trade-off. Something else has to give, and what gave was your gut. As your ancestors' brains grew, their digestive systems shrunk and simplified. You can see this in the fossil record. Earlier hominins had large, complex guts designed to extract nutrition from tough plant material. Later humans have shorter, simpler digestive tracts. But there's a catch. You can only afford a simpler gut if you're eating higher quality food. Foods that are already partially broken down, easier to digest, more nutrient-dense, and that means meat. This is where Africa's protein-rich environment becomes absolutely critical. The savanna grasslands supported massive herds of large mammals, antelope, zebra, wildebeest, buffalo. During certain seasons, the biomass of large herbivores in African savannas was higher than anywhere else on Earth. And where there are herbivores, there are predators. And where predators kill, there are scavenging opportunities. Your ancestors became systematic scavengers, probably using their tools to rapidly cut meat from carcasses before the original predators or other scavengers drove them away. Over time, they became hunters themselves, and the more meat they ate, the more they could afford to maintain those expensive growing brains. It's a feedback loop. Better tools mean more access to meat. More meat supports bigger brains. Bigger brains enable creation of even better tools, round and round, accelerating with each generation. And it's all happening in Africa because nowhere else offered this specific combination of open habitats, abundant large mammals, and environmental pressures that made intelligence the key to survival. But just bigger brains aren't enough. You also need to know how to use them. And this is where fire enters the story. 1 million years ago, maybe earlier, your ancestors in Africa accomplished something no other species had managed. They learned to control fire, not just using fire when they found it naturally, but actually maintaining it, transporting it, probably creating it. The archaeological evidence is scattered across Africa. Burnt bones in South African caves, carefully constructed hearths in East African sites, ash layers in rock shelters showing controlled burning repeated over thousands of years. This is systematic fire use, and it absolutely changed everything. Fire gave your ancestors control over their environment in ways that would have seemed like magic to earlier hominins. You could cook food, which made it easier to digest and increase the calories you could extract from each meal. You could stay warm on cold nights, expanding your range into cooler regions. You could keep predators at bay, transforming vulnerable sleeping areas into safe refuges. You could harden wooden spears, making them more effective hunting weapons. But fire did something even more important. It created a gathering place. Imagine your ancestors sitting around the fire as darkness falls. The flames keep lions and hyenas at bay. The warmth is comforting after a long day of foraging and hunting. And in that protected space, with hours of darkness ahead and nothing to do but wait for morning, they talked. Fire extended the social day. It gave your ancestors time to share knowledge, tell stories, plan the next day's activities, teach children the complex skills they'd need to survive. Every evening around the fire was a classroom, a strategy session, a cultural transmission event. This is probably where language really started developing. Oh, your ancestors had been communicating for millions of years before this: gestures, calls, simple vocalizations. But around the fire, with time to spare and complex knowledge to share, language could become something truly sophisticated. And African conditions made language particularly valuable, because surviving in Africa's variable environment required accumulating and sharing enormous amounts of knowledge. You needed to know where water sources were during dry seasons, information that might only be relevant once every few years. You needed to understand the behavioral patterns of dozens of different animals, which ones you could hunt, which ones would hunt you, which ones indicated nearby water or food. You needed to track seasonal changes, predict weather patterns, remember the locations of productive foraging areas spread across hundreds of square miles. No individual could hold all this knowledge, but a group that could share knowledge verbally could pool their collective experience. The old woman who remembered the drought 30 years ago could tell young hunters where to find water when the rivers dried up. The man who survived a lion attack could describe exactly how the predator behaved, helping others avoid the same fate. The mother who knew which plants were poisonous could teach her daughters who could teach their daughters, preserving life-saving knowledge across generations. Language wasn't just communication. It was a survival technology, maybe the most important one your ancestors ever developed. And like tool-making and fire control, it was refined in Africa's unique pressure cooker of environmental challenges and opportunities. For decades, scientists had been building this story piece by piece. Fossils from Ethiopia, stone tools from Tanzania, genetic samples from populations around the world. Each discovery added another piece to the puzzle of why humans evolved only in Africa. But here's the thing about scientific puzzles. Sometimes you assemble 95% of the picture and think you understand everything. Then someone finds that last 5% and suddenly the entire image snaps into crystal clarity. That's what happened between 2023 and 2024. In January 2023, a team of genome researchers published something extraordinary in the journal Science. They had analyzed DNA from over 290,000 individuals representing every major population group on Earth. They weren't just looking at current genetic diversity, but using sophisticated computational models to reconstruct our species' population history, going back 2 million years. What they found stopped the scientific community in its tracks. The data showed not one but multiple severe population bottlenecks in human evolutionary history. But what made everyone sit up and pay attention was this: they all happened only in Africa. Every single population crash that shaped our species, every near-extinction event, every genetic bottleneck occurred on a single continent, and the timing was perfect for explaining the unique evolutionary pressures that created modern humans. The most severe bottleneck we discussed earlier occurred around 930,000 years ago and lasted 117,000 years. But the new data revealed something even more fascinating. There were smaller bottlenecks before and after this event. Another population crash around 1.2 million years ago, another squeeze around 600,000 years ago, each one Africa only, each one corresponding to climate records showing extreme mega droughts that turned vast regions of the continent into uninhabitable wasteland. Now, population bottlenecks aren't unusual in evolution. Many species experience them, but what made these discoveries revolutionary was the comparative data. The same genomic techniques applied to other primate populations, other large mammals, even other human species like Neanderthals and Denisovans showed completely different patterns. Non-African species did show bottlenecks, but they were random, scattered, caused by local catastrophes or isolated climate events. The African pattern was different, systematic, repeated, directly linked to continent-wide climate cycles that weren't happening anywhere else on Earth. This wasn't bad luck, it was something specific to Africa itself. Then in August 2023, paleontologists working in Kenya's Ologi Sali Basin announced a discovery that filled one of the most vexing gaps in the fossil record. They had found a nearly complete skull dating to 760,000 years ago, right in the middle of the recovery period after the Great Bottleneck. The skull was striking. It showed intermediate features between earlier Homo erectus populations and later Homo sapiens. A slightly larger brain case than erectus, but not quite modern. More gracile bone structure but still robust compared to us. And most importantly, evidence of rapid evolutionary change. When they compared this skull to others from the same region dating to 900,000 years ago and 600,000 years ago, they could see evolution fast-forwarding. Brain size increasing by 15% over 300,000 years, facial structure becoming more refined, teeth getting smaller indicating dietary changes and better food processing. This was direct fossil evidence of the evolutionary transformation triggered by the bottleneck, proof that those 117,000 years of near extinction weren't just about survival, they were about fundamental biological change. But the real bombshell came from what they found alongside the skull. Stone tools unlike any seen before from that period. Not just basic choppers and scrapers, but carefully worked points designed for specific purposes. Knives with serrated edges for cutting plant fibers, scrapers with precisely shaped working edges for processing hides, and most remarkably, evidence of hafting stone points attached to wooden handles using plant resins. This technology wasn't supposed to exist 760,000 years ago. By previous timelines, hafted tools didn't emerge until maybe 300,000 years ago. But here was undeniable proof that our ancestors coming out of the bottleneck were innovating far earlier than anyone had imagined. They weren't just surviving, they were inventing. Then climate scientists entered the picture with their own revelations. Using new computational models that could simulate ancient weather patterns with unprecedented accuracy, researchers reconstructed Africa's climate over the last 2 million years and compared it to conditions on every other continent during the same period. The results were stark. Africa experienced literally off-the-charts climate variability compared to anywhere else. Europe had its ice ages, sure. Asia had monsoon cycles, of course. The Americas had their own regional climate patterns, but none of them came close to the extreme, rapid, unpredictable climate swings that characterized Africa during the critical period of human evolution. The models showed mega droughts in Africa lasting thousands of years, reducing rainfall by 80% or more across regions the size of Western Europe. Then sudden reversals, monsoon systems shifting, and transforming deserts back into grasslands in just a few decades. This kind of climate whiplash created exactly the conditions for rapid evolutionary change. Populations had to adapt quickly or die, but the crucial detail the models revealed was this: these extreme conditions resulted from Africa's unique position relative to global ocean currents and atmospheric circulation patterns. The continent straddles the equator, is surrounded by two major ocean systems, is affected by multiple monsoon patterns, and is critically influenced by changes in ocean temperature that other continents were buffered from. This meant the extreme climate variability wasn't a fluke. It was a permanent feature of African geography. No other continent was positioned to experience the same conditions. No other landmass could create the same evolutionary pressure cooker. If you wanted to design a continent specifically to force rapid human evolution, you couldn't do better than Pleistocene Africa. So let's address the question you're probably asking. If conditions in Africa were so perfect for human evolution, could it have happened elsewhere? Could Asia have produced humans, Europe, the Americas, or Australia? It's a fair question, and the answer is fascinating because when you actually look at the details, when you examine what every other continent had or didn't have during the critical period, you realize something incredible. Nowhere else on Earth could have done it, not even close. Let's start with Asia. At first glance, Asia looks promising. Massive, spanning multiple climate zones from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra. Diverse ecosystems, abundant wildlife, mountain ranges, river valleys, everything you'd think you need for human evolution. But here's what Asia didn't have: the right kind of instability. See, for most of the last 10 million years, Asia's climate was relatively stable. Not unchanging, but stable in a way that didn't create the intense selection pressure needed for rapid brain evolution. Sure, there were ice ages and warm periods, but the transitions were gradual. Populations had time to migrate, to find new regions when conditions changed. There was no forcing function, no environmental pressure cooker demanding adapt or die on the timescales needed to drive brain expansion. Europe had an even bigger problem: temperature. For most of the period when human evolution was happening in Africa, Europe was experiencing repeated glaciation cycles, glaciers advancing and retreating, temperatures dropping so low that survival required very specific adaptations. This wasn't selecting for big brains and complex social behavior. It was selecting for physical robustness, cold adaptation, and efficient metabolism. These aren't the kind of environmental conditions that support evolution of large-brained primates. Large brains are metabolically expensive. They require enormous amounts of calories, stable food sources, and environments that reward intelligence over other survival strategies. Ice Age Europe was rewarding none of these things. The Americas present an even clearer case. North and South America had no great apes, not during the critical period. Not ever. The closest relatives to African apes in the Americas were New World monkeys, which diverged from our lineage about 40 million years ago. They were separated from us by such a vast evolutionary chasm that no selection pressure could have closed it in the timescales we're talking about. Even if climate and geography had been perfect, and they weren't, the starting material wasn't there. Australia might be the most dramatic example of how isolation affects evolutionary outcomes. Here's a continent that's been largely isolated for 50 million years since it split from Antarctica and drifted north. And what evolved there? Marsupials. Incredibly diverse, beautifully adapted marsupials filling ecological niches similar to placental mammals on other continents, but no primates. Not even primitive ones. The ancestors of primates never reached Australia before it separated from other land masses, so there was literally zero chance of human evolution happening there. The developmental starting point was missing, absent due to tens of millions of years of evolutionary divergence. So here we are, after everything we've discovered, all the climate catastrophes and evolutionary pressure, all the extinct species and bottleneck events, all the predators and prey and desperate survival struggles, we return to the same incredible truth. Africa made us human. Not just technically, not just as the place where our species happen to evolve, but fundamentally, everything that makes us human, our intelligence, our adaptability, our capacity for cooperation, our ability to create art and technology and language, all of it was forged in Africa's unique crucible. Think about what had to come together for this to happen. Climate instability that forced rapid adaptation or death. Geographic isolation that prevented our ancestors from simply migrating away when things got tough. Predator pressure that made us smarter rather than stronger. Ecological diversity that rewarded behavioral flexibility rather than physical specialization. The timing of every challenge arriving exactly when our ancestors were ready to respond to it. Change any of these factors and humans probably never evolve. Move the story to Europe and our ancestors migrate south during ice ages, never developing the adaptations that make us unique. Set it in Asia, and the geographic scale is too vast. Populations spread out too much to maintain the selection pressure needed for rapid evolution. Put it anywhere else on Earth, and the combination of pressures isn't right. Only Africa had everything. Only Africa could do this. And what this means is this. Every person listening to this, wherever you are right now, whatever you look like, whatever language you speak, you are African. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. Your ancestors survived that 117,000-year bottleneck. They endured mega droughts and volcanic winters that blocked out the sun. They learned to hunt in coordinated groups and share knowledge across generations. They developed the first tools, the first art, the first abstract thought. They carry the fused chromosome 2 that marks them as survivors of the greatest crisis in human history. And then when the climate finally improved, they spread across the world, carrying Africa with them. Every step from the Rift Valley to the Arabian Peninsula, from India to China, from Siberia across the Bering Land Bridge to the Americas, they were carrying African adaptations into new environments, African intelligence solving new problems, African resilience facing new challenges. The relatively minor differences we see between human populations today, skin color, facial features, body proportions, these only evolved in the last 60,000 years. Superficial adaptations to local conditions, minor variations on African themes. But the things that really matter, the cognitive abilities that allow us to dominate this planet, the social intelligence that lets us build civilizations, the creativity that produces art and science and philosophy, all African, all ancient, all shared by every human who has ever lived. This isn't just interesting history. This is knowledge that should fundamentally reshape how we think about human diversity and human unity. When you look at another person, any person, no matter how different they might appear, you're looking at another African, another descendant of those 1,180 survivors, another carrier of genes tested and refined by the most challenging conditions imaginable. We are all literally family, not distant cousins but close relatives separated by just a few hundred generations. The genetic differences between any two humans are vanishingly small compared to the similarities. We share almost everything that matters, and we're still learning. Right now, at this very moment, researchers across Africa are uncovering new evidence about our origins. New fossil sites in Morocco, Chad, Kenya, South Africa, each revealing another piece of the puzzle. Genetic studies finding new evidence of ancient bottlenecks and population movements. Archaeological discoveries showing how our ancestors developed technology and culture. Africa hasn't finished teaching us about ourselves. Every year brings new revelations, new understanding of how this extraordinary continent shaped everything we are. Africa was our birthplace, but it was also our proving ground. The place where random apes became thinking beings, where survival required not just strength but intelligence, not just instinct but innovation, where the challenges were so intense that only the most adaptable, most cooperative, most creative individuals could pass on their genes. We are the product of that testing ground. Every one of us. We carry Africa in our DNA, in our minds, in the structure of our chromosomes. And this isn't where our story ends, it's where it begins. Because everything humans have accomplished since leaving Africa, every civilization we've built, every technology we've invented, every work of art we've created, all of it was made possible by what Africa turned us into. We are all African. We are all survivors. We all carry the legacy of the greatest evolutionary story ever told. If this video has given you a new perspective on human origins and our shared heritage, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and let's see how far our African family has spread across the world. And subscribe because there's so much more to discover about who we are. Remember, every person alive today carries Africa in their DNA. We're not just from Africa. We are Africa scattered across the world, but forever connected by the journey that made us human. Good night.